to KalikoVision, a podcast devoted to helping you see clearly in the seemingly post-fact era of smoke and mirrors. We'll be interviewing people from all walks of life, each with a unique vision for the future. Now more than ever, it is critical for each of us to harness our strengths and our skill sets to take control of our collective destiny. Strap in and let's see where today's conversation takes us. It's time for another episode of KalikoVision.
America, we have come so far. We have seen so much, but there's so much more to do.
What makes this movement unique is we are taking on the corporate establishment. We are taking on the greed of Wall Street.
What are we talking about? We're talking about a hedge fund that serves a bunch of billionaire family offices? Who cares?
It is a movement which says the United States will have health care for all as a human right.
This is our chance to answer that call.
Let them get wiped out. Who cares? They don't get to summer in the Hamptons? Who cares?
Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time.
This is about our lives. This is about American lives.
And that shows you what one voice can do. One voice can change a room. And if it can change a room, it can change a city. And if it can change a city, it can change a state. And if it can change a state, it can change a nation. And if it can change a nation, it can change the world.
Aloha, everybody. My name is Kaliko Castille. I'm your host here at KalikoVision. This is our very first podcast after the relaunch since we first initially did this podcast back in 2020 during the pandemic. But then a lot of life happened. So we settled down, decided to take a break from it. But now, 5 years later, here we are in now August of 2025, deciding to restart this journey with you guys to talk a little bit about the things that I enjoy, the things that I'm interested in. But more importantly, this podcast is meant to help you see clearly through the sort of post-fact era of smoke and mirrors. As you may know, we're living through the second Trump administration right now. So up is down, down is up. Nobody knows what's going on. And so I'm here to just, put out a podcast every week, talking to my friends in various parts throughout the world to talk about their little sphere of influence and what it is that they're focused on and the things that they're excited about that makes the future bright for them. So, once again, my name is Kaliko Castille. I'm a father. I've got two daughters. One just turned 2, one will be 4 in November. I'm a husband. We've been married since 2021. Since I put out this pandemic, a lot of things have changed. Like I said, obviously we went through a global pandemic. We went through pretty crazy election in 2020 and again in 2024. When I was podcasting back in May, when I did my last episode, it was just a month before, 2 months before my grandma had passed away. I left my job a couple of weeks after she had passed away in August of 2020. Left my job as the head of growth at the National Cannabis Industry Association, where I oversaw the marketing, communications, and business development teams. Went on to start my own digital strategy firm called Thunderstorm Strategies, where we worked with cannabis businesses as well as political campaigns. Got the pleasure to work with Oregon State Treasurer Tobias Reed on his re-election campaign, as well as his primary for governor in 2022. He's now the Secretary of State. I managed to work with a bunch of cannabis companies, some dispensaries, some ancillary companies as well. And I also managed to run for office myself in 2022. I ran for state rep here in Oregon in House District 41, where I live in the Milwaukee, Southeast Portland area. Excuse me. We didn't end up winning, but it was an awesome opportunity to learn a lot and to sort of test my theory of the case and how I think about campaigns and politics. So learned a lot in 2022 when I ran, but just before that, just a few months before that, we'd actually had our very first baby in 2021, Kaliko Lehua Okalani. A lot of people know her as Lehua. Now we have our second daughter, Pohaike Aloha, who just turned 2 last month. So fully in dad mode, fully in girl dad life. Stepped down from the presidency of the Minority Cannabis Business Association just last year, where I was president for 3 years. I'd served on the board a little over 5 years. I saw a lot of progress and a lot of really cool things done there. during my time at MCBA. But, it was time for me to kind of move on from the cannabis industry, at least full time. And now I'm the political director at Apano, which was previously known as the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, since rebranded as the Apano Communities United Fund on the C3 side. They also have a C4 called Apano Action Fund, and I actually oversee the politics, policy, advocacy, and civic engagement team that sit both on the C3 and the C4 side. So doing a little bit of the lobbying and the educational, the civic engagement work, but then also the more hard knocks political stuff on the C4 side. So a lot of things have changed since I first started to want to do this podcast back in 2020. Like I said, pandemic happened. I got married. I had a couple of kids, quit my job, started a new business. So, life wasn't really conducive for doing a regular podcast. But now that things are sort of settling in a little bit more, and I really feel the need to have an outlet to talk about all of the political things that are going on. That's why I'm starting this new podcast. We're hoping to do this weekly, calling it KalikoVision. For folks who don't know, my name Kaliko is actually Hawaiian. It means the bud that blossoms. It was a name given to my dad when he was dancing hula under a really well-known kumu named John Keola Maka'ainana Lake. He had passed away, I think, in the 90s, but he had given my dad that name Kaliko that was passed on to me. And then now my daughter, Kaliko Lehua Okalani, also carries that name. And so, the reason why I'm really starting this is to, talk about the things that interest me, right? Some of it's going to be mainstream American politics. Some of it's going to be some really interesting stuff about the Hawaiian kingdom, the sort of political history of Hawaii and the current illegal occupation by the United States of the Hawaiian kingdom. I'm going to have plenty of rants in this space, sort of a chance to sort of talk out some of the strategic frameworks and the sort of things that I'm thinking about, and just really to have a conversation with you. Like, if you're listening to this podcast, I hope you'll leave comments on my Instagram. I hope you'll send us an email. I haven't yet set up an email for this podcast, but eventually I'll have one. You can find me, like I said, on social media, but, leave us comments and information on when you're subscribing to us, or you want to leave us a review on the podcast platforms. We'll be on Apple Podcasts, I think Amazon, as well as Spotify as well. And, I really think that heading into this next election in 2026, we should start having some really important conversations about really important political topics. And so, this is going to be a place where I'm hopefully going to be putting out consistent content, having some really bold conversations and really pushing, different narratives and really trying to break through the traditional way things are talked about across so many different issues, and really try to paint a vision for what I think about what the world should look like, right? My Kaliko vision, as I bring more folks on here week to week, I'm going to ask them, what is your vision for the future? And hopefully, we'll help to get inspired and think about things that, are beyond this current moment, which feels so fraught, feels so dangerous, feels very scary. But I want us to be able to think about, like, beyond this moment of the pendulum, when we swing back the other way, what are things going to look like? So I've been kind of giving some thoughts to, like, what is a Kaliko vision, right? And for me, it's really a world where everyone has what they need, has the opportunity to pursue their dreams, and the right to live free from exploitation, right? Whether that's from your government, from your employer, or from other individuals. And ultimately a world where we love first and ask questions later. A few years ago, my wife and I had started, we'd printed up some stickers that we were thinking about starting a nonprofit called Love First, with really this idea that we were pushing back against sort of like all of the violence, the school violence that was happening at the time. And then in the first Trump administration, some of the family separation policies, this idea that rather than shoot first, ask questions later, which is very much, I think, an American mentality. Like, what is it like for us to love first and ask questions later, right? To assume the best intentions and the best outcomes for people, and, not always worry about, like, what are people doing to take advantage of me? And so that's really what I'm going to be pushing for, is a brighter future where we're not all afraid of each other or afraid of, the outside, but really have an opportunity to paint a vision for what the future could hold. Another thing I want to make sure that I have a chance to talk about, this is one of the first topics I want to talk about in this podcast. And then today, we actually have a really cool interview with Adam Smith. He's the brand new executive director at the Marijuana Policy Project. Good friend of mine. I've known him for over 10 years now, but he just took on this role as ED of the Marijuana Policy Project. We're going to be talking to him a little bit later about what's his vision for the cannabis industry of the future, the cannabis movement. What does it look like for this to continue to happen in a state-by-state patchwork? So chat with him a little bit later on in the program. But one of the first topics I want to talk about, and a thing we'll probably bring up in this podcast quite a bit, is that I believe that every Democrat must be primaried, right? So I'm a proud Democrat. I'm somebody who has voted Democrat my entire life, done a lot of work for Democratic candidates. I've been a consultant for Democratic campaigns. But I'm somebody who's upset with the current party, right? Who's upset with the way things are. And I think that, if not for the Democratic Party, if the Democratic Party were actually to hold true to a lot of the things that they've always said in the past, we wouldn't have Trump. It is because we've gotten away from what I see as being the core ideals of the Democratic Party, working for the working class, protecting the most vulnerable among us, that we're actually in this place right now where Republicans are, taking over. You got Donald Trump in the White House. The Republicans control the Supreme Court, a lot of state legislatures right now. And I think the part of that is because as a party, we're not having real conversations about what we should be doing to address the needs of working people, right? I'm somebody that even in 2012 thought that Barack Obama should have been primaried because that's how we have conversations in the party about what makes our party better and ultimately what makes the country, our state, and our local cities better, right? And so I've been actually playing and floating around with this idea of running for office to challenge my current Congresswoman, Janelle Bynum, to a primary in 2026, largely because her very first vote in Congress was to vote in favor of the Lake and Riley Act. And for those who have been following along, it's a Republican bill they've been pushing for quite some time that helped to undermine due process. It's essentially what they're using right now to demand that everybody who's here undocumented and even going through the process of going through court cases and stuff, that's how they're being removed from courthouses and being taken by ICE, even without being convicted of a crime, even without going through their entire due process. And that's because they passed this Lake and Riley Act, which basically says if you're here undocumented and you've even been accused of a crime, not convicted of a crime, but accused of a crime, that you can not that you can, but that you must be deported by ICE. And so you're seeing a lot of people being rounded up as they're rightfully showing up for court dates and for hearings, going through the regular process to try to, be legitimately, registered as a resident in this country. And ICE is picking them up and just shipping them off to other countries, right? And so Congresswoman Janelle Bynum here in the Oregon's 5th District had voted for that. She also voted a couple months ago to praise ICE in a congressional resolution that was also condemning an anti-Semitic attack in Colorado. But in that same resolution, they also had a line in there that was praising ICE. So she voted for that. She joined the Republicans to vote against the clean energy standards in California. The California clean energy standards were set up so that by 2035, all cars that are sold in the state of California must be electric vehicles. And Janelle Bynum, with some other Democrats, voted with a bunch of Republicans to kind of condemn that move, right? And this is coming from a person who represents a state that's going through a bunch of wildfires right now. We're in the middle of wildfire season, which is a direct result of climate change and the climate crisis. And we here in Oregon, that's not something we were used to when we were growing up, and now are having to become used to sort of fire season. And at the same time that Congresswoman Janelle Bynum represents a district that is dealing with wildfires right now, she voted to do anything about changing the systemic problems with the climate crisis, right? Which is that California is one of the largest markets for vehicles, period, and that they were demanding that all vehicles in that market be sold, or that are sold, be electric vehicles by 2035. And she just voted against that, right? She just voted just last week to support Trump's Genius Act, which is a bill that's basically having free range for the crypto market. It's providing some regulations, but more than anything is really allowing the crypto market to run wild and potentially lead us to, some economic disasters if they were to couple the crypto market with the mainstream financial services market. So going to be looking out for that. But there's so many of these ways in which Bynum has voted with Republicans and is clearly not she's not representing those who did the work to get her into office, right? She won after beating Lori Chavez de Remer, who was a Republican who was elected after the previous Democratic Congressman Kurt Schrader was knocked out by Jamie McLeod Skinner in 2022. She beat him in a primary and then lost in the general when the DCCC didn't put any money or really any support into that race. So we lost it to a Republican in 2022. And then in 2024 is when Janelle Bynum went up against Jamie McLeod Skinner, beat her in a primary, and then defeated Lori Chavez de Remer. But you wouldn't know that we don't have a Republican congressperson by the way she's voting right now. So, I've been over the course of this summer really kind of playing with this idea, having a lot of conversations with folks, both in sort of my circles in the sort of Clackamas County area in Milwaukee, as well as in the sort of political ecosystem here in Oregon. And I think there's a lot of encouraging conversations. I think there's definitely a path to potentially knock her out in a primary, but it's just not the right time for me and my family right now, having two young daughters, as I talked about, one about to be 4 in November, one that just turned 2. We'd have to split the family between the two coasts. We're not going to move them to Washington, D.C. and uproot them from their school and from sort of our, support system. And then it wouldn't make sense for me to be commuting literally every week on Thursdays and Sundays to only see the girls a couple of days a week. So deciding not to run in this race, but I'm not letting up on Janelle Bynum, and I don't think that anybody should let up on any Democrat right now. Even if they're not holding a primary challenge in 2026, we need to be showing up to their town halls. We need to be putting the pressure on them. In addition to all these shitty votes that she's making with Republicans, she also hasn't said one word about the starvation and the genocide happening in Gaza, right? And this is a woman who got $3.5 million from AIPAC and AIPAC affiliated organizations in her race against Jamie McLeod Skinner in 2024. So that's, I did the math recently and I can't remember what the number was, but it is much more. She has had much more, it was a couple times more dollars donated to her in one campaign cycle than the entirety of the Oregon congressional delegation over the course of their lives, right? Ron Wyden, who just in a big vote against in the Senate last week, Jeff Merkley came out and condemned what was going on in Palestine, and then also voted to block military aid to Israel, which was the right vote. Well, Ron Wyden from our congressional delegation voted against it. He's received a lot of money from AIPAC over the course of his career, but not nearly as much as Janelle Bynum, who's tweeted honestly more about name, image, and likeness rules in the NCAA, which is she has a kid who's a collegiate athlete, but she's tweeted more about the NIL rules than she's tweeted about children starving and being bombed in Gaza right now. It's disgusting, and I do wish I could run against her next year, but for now we're going to be showing up to all her town halls and making sure that we're just holding her feet to the fire and that she knows that her constituents are paying attention. She actually has I'll drop it here in our show notes as well, but she actually has a town hall coming up on August 25th. And my friend Tobias Reed will be there as Secretary of State as part of that as well. But I'm planning on going. I'll be there protesting Janelle Bynum, letting people know that she voted for the Laken Riley Act, continues to vote with Republicans. And then in general, it's just not a great representation for Oregon's 5th district. And real quick, before I move off of the topic of primarying Democrats, who's going to primary Tina Kotek? The answer is no one, right? I'm looking around. It's clear that no one's going to actually disrupt the system here. But if you've been paying attention, Tina Kotek, who's the current governor of Oregon, came out at the end of the legislative session, the final couple of days of the legislative session, and worked with Democratic leadership to try to kill preschool for all, which is a universal preschool system that was set up in Multnomah County, is run off of a very small tax on the richest 1% or the richest folks in Multnomah County. And it's managed to open up a bunch of preschool seats for a bunch of kids who otherwise wouldn't be able to get in. But she's doing the bidding of her rich donors who, are threatening to move out of Multnomah County if this tax isn't killed. And so she tried to work with a leadership during the legislative session to pass a bill that would have just stopped the collection of the tax and essentially kill the program, doing the bidding for these folks, but then had a massive backlash from community members and from the Friends for Preschool for All coalition, as well as the Child Care for Oregon coalition, which I'm a part of at Apano. I mean, that amongst a bunch of other things during this legislative season, in which I don't think right now that Tina Kotek is showing that she has the interest of working class Oregonians and the most vulnerable Oregonians like top of mind. It's clear heading into the 2026 election, it seems like we're more concerned about fundraising and doing the bidding of our funders rather than doing the hard work for working Oregonians. We just came through a tough budget year. The governor's recommended budget wasn't the greatest recommended budget, but it still preserved a lot of things that the legislature ended up cutting after getting a lower forecast. But, I overall just want to plant the flag in the ground and say that we need to start running primaries against our friends in the Democratic Party here in Oregon because the circles are too tight. We're unwilling to say the hard things to our friends, and we just perpetuate the cycle of what feels like being out of touch, right? We're coming off of an administration with Kate Brown where they were able to paint her as being out of touch and sort of this like Portland liberal who didn't care about what people thought or like what working class people were caring about. And we're just having that perpetuated right now, I think, under the Tina Kotek administration, especially when she is trying to essentially make it harder for poor kids to get into preschool by alleviating rich people's tax issues. Not to mention they just got a bunch of tax cuts in the Trump administration. And for some reason, we feel like we need to be giving them a local tax cut here at home as well. So I'll probably have more on that later on down the road, but I'm just trying to be historically right that if we were to see a Republican get into office anytime soon, it's going to be because they're able to continue to point Democrats as being out of touch with the average working Oregonian. And when you're doing things like, fighting over taxing and tolling of 205 and, doing the bidding of your highest donors in Multnomah County, I don't think it bids well for Oregon, for Democrats going forward. So one last thing I wanted to cover before we jump into this really awesome interview I did with Adam Smith from the Marijuana Policy Project is that just this week on August 1st, Apple TV just launched a brand new series called Chief of War, which is executive produced, co-written by Jason Momoa. I'm sure everybody knows who Jason Momoa is, right? Aquaman, he was in Game of Thrones at one point as well. Well, Jason Momoa has now actually been working for the last 10 years on a project called Chief of War, based on the story of Kaiana, a relatively well-known Hawaiian chief. And this kind of sets back in the 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s of late 1700s in the Hawaiian kingdoms, the 4 Hawaiian kingdoms, right? Before the islands were unified under Kamehameha. And this is basically talking of the coming prophecy about Kamehameha uniting the islands and sort of what it was like to live in those 4 separate kingdoms at the time. But it shows it through the lens and through the sort of like the point of view of Kaiana, played by Jason Momoa, who is an alii or a chief from Maui who goes off to Kauai for a period of time, but then is being summoned back by Kahekili, who is the chief of Maui, who thinks that he's going to be the prophesized one to unite the islands. It's super fascinating. Only 2 episodes have been released so far. The first one's pretty bloody because there's a lot of battle in it. And if for folks who are uninitiated, the warrior lifestyle and the battles in the early 1700s or in the early Hawaii days were not pretty, right? It was not clean. Like, it's not like fighting with guns is clean anyways, but they were fighting with, wood sticks and instruments that had shark teeth on them and stuff. So if you're not prepared for that sort of action packed, fight scenes, prepare yourself now. But it's an amazing film. And the best thing about it is that it was written and it is spoken in all Olelo Hawaii, which is the Hawaiian language, right? So there's subtitles at the bottom. You can still understand everything that's going on, but it's spoken in the native Hawaiian tongue, and it's a native Hawaiian story told from a native Hawaiian perspective on one of the largest platforms in the world, right? And so it's number 1 on Apple TV's streaming TV shows right now. If you were to go open Apple TV, you'll see it up at the top. It's amazing. It truly is awesome. I'm still kind of honestly processing some of it, and I'm excited that we have a interview coming up next week with a family member of mine who is also one of the premier scholars around Hawaiian sovereignty and sort of the illegal occupation of Hawaii, named Keanu Sai, Dr. Keanu Sai. He's going to come on and talk to me next week, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Hawaiian kingdom, the political history, talk a little bit about like chief of war, but then more broadly, like what are the implications about sort of the legal this legal situation that's going on in Hawaii, which is illegal occupation under international and constitutional law. And he's going to explain that to us. And I'm also going to draw some of the parallels between the war crimes. I call them war crimes because they're legally war crimes, basically violations of the Geneva and Hague Conventions, which set out the rules of war. We'll talk a little bit more about that with Keanu. But, we're going to draw some of the parallels between what's going on in Hawaii and what's been going on in Ukraine, what's been going on in Palestine as well. A lot of the issues that you would talk about when it comes to international law and sort of the legalities and the rules of war and occupation that are happening in Hawaii, there's similar situations and similar, I think, legal lines to draw sort of parallels to, right? So looking forward to having that conversation with him next week. If you haven't had a chance yet, please go to Apple TV, check out Chief of War. We also just want to support this project. It's mainly Polynesian actors, Hawaiian, Samoan, folks coming from Aotearoa. So I really want to make sure that we're supporting this because I think this could lead to a lot of productions of Native stories being told, once again, from a Native perspective in the Native tongue on these really large platforms, because they're every bit as entertaining, they're every bit as interesting as any other, show or story that we'd be hearing. We're just finally hearing it from this sort of subsection of the world that we haven't heard from before. So, or at least not on this scale. So I appreciate everybody listening to KalikoVision as I sort of lay out some of the stuff we're going to chat about in a week to week. I'll be bringing some of the top headlines that I'm really paying attention to and the things that I think you should be paying attention to as we try to cut through the noise and all the smoke and mirrors, as I called it in the intro. But right now I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to my interview with Adam Smith. Once again, he's the executive director of the Marijuana Policy Project, one of the premier policy organizations in the marijuana movement. They've been doing work at the state level across the country since the mid-90s. They've helped pass a lot of legalization efforts and are still very active. I was just working with Karen O'Keefe, who Adam Smith mentioned in our interview, during doing some legalization work in Hawaii. So I know they're very active all over the place, but really excited for this interview with Adam, where we talk about sort of his vision for the future of MPP, the vision of the future of the movement, and then ultimately, what it is that we should be thinking about when we're trying to continue to move this ball forward in the second Trump administration. And at this time when it feels like not much of anything is really moving at the federal level, like how can we make sure that we still are making sure that people are not getting put behind bars for a plant, that when they are trying to get access to cannabis, that they're having safely tested and, safe products on the shelves that is transparent and has some laid out testing standards around it. So a little great conversation coming up here with Adam in just a second, but I appreciate you listening to KalikoVision, and we'll see you here again in the next episode. Aloha, everybody. Thank you for listening. This is KalikoVision. I'm your host, Kaliko Castille. Really appreciate you joining us, and I'm really excited about today's interview. It's the very first interview in the relaunch of our podcast, KalikoVision. We haven't done since the pandemic, but I'm really excited to have the very first interview of the brand new executive director for the Marijuana Policy Project. You might know it as MPP. Happens to be one of my good friends, Adam Smith. We kind of got to know each other through some cannabis initiative processes here in Oregon back in 2012, I want to say, maybe 2014. And so there's been quite some time, but this gentleman has a very storied career. Like I said, he's the new executive director at MPP. But before that, he's had a long history of working in the drug war broadly, not just cannabis, worked on stopthedrugwar.org, being one of the, being the associate director at stopthedrugwar.org. He also launched The Week Online, the nation's first publication, providing original coverage of domestic and international policy from a reform perspective. And then a couple of years later, he helped to launch the Higher Education Reform Campaign, the first successful effort to roll back federal drug war legislation. And then shortly after that, helped with the founding of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, where he helped incubate it for the first couple of years before it launched as its own standalone organization. For folks in the cannabis industry, you might know him as the founder of the Craft Cannabis Alliance, or Alliance for Sensible Markets, where he has been pushing to help give a voice to small and medium-sized cannabis businesses, especially craft growers, and talking a lot about sort of what does it look like to have interstate commerce, even potentially ahead of federal prohibition falling. So I'm really excited to talk with Adam Smith, my good friend, on the line here with me today. So Adam, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Kaliko, it's great to be here. I'm so honored to be the first guest on the relaunch of your podcast, and I'm excited that this is my first podcast as ED of MPP. So this is an auspicious moment for everyone.
I love it. Yes. And for folks that may not be paying attention to my own personal career, I spent the last 13 years in the cannabis industry, but the last year I kind of shifted away into the mainstream political world. I'm now the political director at a nonprofit here in Oregon. But during my time in the cannabis industry, was very involved in a lot of the policy conversations. So I'm excited to have this conversation with Adam today. At a time when I think there's a lot of shift going on in the cannabis industry and the movement in general. But I kind of want to start at the beginning. So when we read your bio, we talked about stopthedrugwar.org. We talked about Students for a Sensible Drug Policy. It was the 90s when you were kind of cutting your teeth in this sort of like drug war movement. Now, we're a couple decades later, but seemingly both at the same time very far ahead of where we were in the 90s, and in some ways seemingly like we're coming back around to some of the same propaganda and some of the same stuff. So I'm kind of curious, what has that journey been like, where you kind of started in the Clinton administration, now we're in the second Trump administration? What does that sort of arc look like for you?
I got involved in drug policy reform when I got introduced to a guy named David Borden, who had started an email discussion list in 1994. And there weren't that many email discussion lists about anything in 1994. I had email for about a week. But David started this discussion around drug policy. And when I got onto that list, there was, about 30 people on it. And it included a number of cannabis reformers, some prison reform activists, needle exchangers, Latin American activists. And so it was really the first place anywhere that folks came together from various parts of drug policy to see themselves as a movement. And we were very focused on getting folks who were starting to get active in these different issues to understand that they were allies and that they were fighting against prohibition. They were fighting against the drug war. And that wasn't always obvious to folks. There was a lot of cannabis people back in those days whose answer was, go arrest the cocaine users. The needle exchangers didn't want to be, associated with cannabis. I mean, it was, and so in a couple of years after that, the web happened, and that little email discussion list became multiple websites, and it became an organization, and it moved down to DC, and then I moved down to DC. And it was interesting. We were the radicals in DC, right? We were, only 21% of the country or something agreed that cannabis should be legal. Only about, 3% of the country was on email yet. So it was really the early days. We were sort of making it up as we went along. And it in a way, it gave us a lot of freedom. We were such the radicals, right, that we could basically just, do what we wanted to do. And we discovered how to do internet activism and watch the whole thing grow. And it's incredible to be here, but it's also a little frustrating to be here 30 years later, that we're still having some of the same arguments and the same fights. But I think a lot has changed, right? Industry has moved in on the cannabis side. Philanthropists have moved on to psychedelics and the next shiny thing. There's a sense that the industry should take care of all this. And quite honestly, as someone who came out of the movement and has been doing work with industry for a while, and coming back to the movement, I think this is a moment where we're in desperate need of a clear movement voice on the cannabis side that is not license holders directly or industry directly. And they have their place, and some of them have done amazing work. But it's time for the movement to have a vision that goes beyond the binary of legal versus illegal.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up about sort of some of the things that we're going back through right now. One of the things that I remember, it was a quote that you had given to me back when we were running the initiative campaign IP24, I think in 2014, where you had said, and it was a quote from someone in your life that had said that you're not radical, you're just a premature moderate. right?
Yeah.
And I think that, like, in a lot of ways, the cannabis industry has sort of shown that, right? When a long time ago, people were thought of as being crazy. When I first got into the industry, or started as an intern at Normal back in 2011, people wouldn't touch this issue with a 10-foot pole, right? And that was not that long ago at this point, considering how long people have been fighting to make cannabis legal. But, you know, I think right now, when we're talking about sort of like, what does it look like going forward, I'd love to kind of like dive into that a little bit. You're newly the head of MPP, but you came to it having already worked running your own organization, really focused on craft growers, focused on sort of getting to interstate commerce and finding, sort of breaking through the logjam of Congress. So, like, how do you sort of see the macro picture of things right now? I know you talked about the need for a one movement voice, but like, how do you see sort of things coming from a place where you're kind of trying to disrupt the system, and now you kind of got to plug in, and you're at one of the more established organizations now in the cannabis movement, and really kind of overseeing one of the last sort of organizations that have any sort of infrastructure. So what does that look like for you right now?
You know, it's interesting. So much of my work around interstate commerce, I put together under the idea that waiting for Congress has never been, to solve this problem has never been a winning strategy, right? And that the states were where the action had been. The states were the entities that had pushed this forward. That especially the new industry had more political reach in the states, right, than we do at the federal level. And so that we should that I thought we could get the states to move things forward without every year waiting for banking to happen, much less actual legalization, right? So MPP for 30 years has been the lead organization doing the work in the states around the country. I walked into MPP. It's kind of amazing. Back in the day, MPP had more than 40 staff, right? And now we have 8. And so that's indicative of what's gone on with the movement. But in addition to that, the 8 people that are there are just incredible. There's this incredible staff at MPP, the legislative team that's led by Karen O'Keefe, Jordan Wellington, who's over at Vicente. Before I had met Karen, described Karen O'Keefe as the best legislative mind in cannabis, and there's no one in tier 2. And I would argue that if there's anyone in tier 2, it's Kevin Caldwell, who works with Karen and leads that team. And Karen has been at MPP for 20 years. She's been involved in most of the big state victories, or has led or been involved in most of the big state victories. And so despite the fact that funding is difficult and the movement is really, has been sidelined a bit, I walked into an incredible situation with a great staff at MPP, and I'm really excited to do that work. And I continue to believe that the action is going to be at the state level, right? I mean, the administration can do almost anything, right? I mean, we're now in a world where the administration seems to function less on policy and more on comparative advantage from day to day, and so it's almost impossible to predict what they're going to see as. It's just as likely that, President Trump decides to deschedule by executive order, even though that's probably outside the scope of his powers as we would have previously understood them. But they have a very broad understanding of executive power, and Congress is probably not going to stop him. So that could happen. He could also decide that it's in his interest to come down on the legal industry. Like I said, because these seem to be less policy decisions than political decisions. And so we're all sort of sitting and waiting. But no matter what the feds do, whether they deschedule, whether they do nothing, whether they reschedule, whether Congress gets it together for the first time and passes the States Act, which is probably the only piece of legislation that has any chance of moving this year at all. It's unlikely that it's going to pass, but there's a universe in which that happens. Even the States Act hands really most of the decision making to the states. And so I think that as we look at where the movement is and where the movement needs to go, right, beyond, like I said, the binary of legal versus illegal, I think that MPP is positioned to have a tremendous impact on that. And I'm really excited.
Awesome. Well, that was kind of like bringing up for me, like you had talked about how like philanthropy has moved on. Like cannabis was the hot thing for a while. They were funding a lot of the initiatives across the country. They saw the sort of how popular this was going to be. And then the industry for a long time, at least during the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, were funding sort of a lot of the efforts, whether that was at the state level or the efforts at the federal level through all of these different organizations. So like, I hear you saying funding is an issue. I hear you saying like this storied organization has gone from 40 employees down to 8. We've seen like the head of NCIA is now stepping aside. There's a lot of movement in the industry right now. Like, how do we fund the effort of getting this done? Like, what is your thoughts on how do we actually get it done, knowing that we live in a system that's completely run by money?
That's funny. Yeah. I mean, I think that over the course of 30 years, the questions that the movement has to address have changed, right? And so so cannabis is legal, state legal in almost half the states. There's another 15 or so states that have medical, and so you start to look at the map. And there aren't a lot of ballot initiative states left. And a lot of the states left that aren't legalized are, Idaho or Louisiana or, some of the southern states that you might not expect there to be, large scale movement on. But MPP will continue its, long work of working to legalize in states where it is not yet legal, right? Our goal is that no one ever be arrested anywhere in this country for use or possession of cannabis. But I think that now that we have, an industry, we really have 3 industries, right? We have the legal regulated industry, we have the semi-regulated or becoming regulated kind of, hemp-derived cannabinoid industry, and we have the illicit industry, which has not gone anywhere. And so I think beyond the question of legal or illegal, consumers, folks who use this plant, folks who depend on this plant, need a movement that is going to lay out a principled stance of what this needs to look like, right? Just making it legal or just stopping arresting people, that's a part of it. But if you don't, if you're not running a successful industry, you end up with several problems, including a legal industry that can't survive, that's not sustainable, which plays into the hands of organized crime and illicit markets. And you have legal markets where we're not sure exactly what's in the supply chain. And so I think as we move into the next phase, the way I've been thinking about it for MPP and for the movement writ large is under a set of 3 principles, which is public health, public safety, and public access. And public health and safety are sort of intertwined with each other, but that would mean a supply chain that is free of dangerous pesticides, heavy metals, mold and fungus, and synthetics, right? A testing program that works, that ensures that what is on the label is actually what is in the product, and that the dosages are close enough not to make a significant difference in the effect of what you're taking. And then to get the criminal market, organized crime in particular, which is a huge problem right now, especially foreign organized crime, to get organized crime out of the supply chains, right? And that to me is like one of the core questions, because for 100 years we tried to do that through prohibition, and we tried to do that through enforcement, and that has not worked. And it's not that enforcement doesn't have a part of it, but what you have is an economics problem. As long as there is profit to be made on the illicit side of this market, we're going to have large profits. We're going to have organized crime involved, and the only way to take the profits out of the illicit market is to offer consumers a choice to move into a regulated market. And that brings us to the third. So public health, public safety, and public access. And public access is about having a broad and varied and sustainable legal industry, and to have that consumers have access through all of the platforms that you would have access to any comparable product. You can buy beer in any convenience store, right? But THC beverages, not as easy to come by. There are huge deserts in legal states where people are, 50, 80, 100 miles from legal access, right? Well, they're not going to drive 100 miles for legal access, or 60 miles or 40 miles when they have somebody who'll come to their door. And so we need to support a legal industry that is safe, well-regulated, responsible, and accessible. And I think there are places that we can align with the industry very strongly under access, right? Access is broad, and increasing access will increase the viability of the industry. And so I think there is some money there, even though the industry has struggled, right? And that's a big part. I mean, the large donors moving on to psychedelics is one part, but the industry is desperately struggling under unfair tax rules and lack of ability to move product, over regulation, over taxation, all of that, negatively impacts access for consumers, and consumers will make the choice to go somewhere they can get it cheaper or easier, and we are stuck in the same boat. And so I think articulating a vision of what this ideally should look like in order to achieve the goals that we set out to at the beginning, no one gets arrested, the criminal element is out of the industry, and the supply of cannabis is safe and accessible.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I love that public health, public safety, and public access. But I'm kind of curious, as you were sort of talking about like the organized crime aspect of it, and we don't have to go too deep into it, but I'm curious, like when you're talking about the sort of access kind of linking to that, like if we give consumers more options, then that will help to drive organized crime out. Do you see that happening without federal prohibition actually ending? Like, is this, can we do this in a patchwork framework?
Well, so a couple of things to remember about federal legalization, right? The feds can legalize tomorrow, and Idaho can still put you in jail for 10 years for a joint if they want, right? Federal legalization might encourage states to move further along the line of regulation, but it doesn't force them. The states still have to make that decision. They can legalize federally tomorrow, and it can still be, and you can be in a legal state, and it can still be illegal for you to grow at home, right? And so I think that in the absence of coordinated federal action that makes some sense and makes it easier, we have an ability, the state regulators have gotten together through an organization called CANRA. And so the state regulators are talking to each other. The states are already trying to figure out what the other states are doing and begin to try to, if not align, to understand, where the differences are. And I think that working with the states, we can start to streamline some of that and help them streamline some of that in preparation for the market that they know is coming, right? Which is, if not a national market, at least a market among legal and medical states. So I think there's a lot we can do on the state level. And I also tend to believe that, we are heading, regardless of what the feds do, unless they do nothing, we are headed down the path toward greater state control. And so we want to expedite that. And I think that it's not true in all of the states, but most of the states, especially the legal adult use states, have a much better handle on this issue than the feds. And we are much better off, I think, there'll be outliers, but I think we're much better off working to have state policy address this than hoping the feds come up with a laundry list of rules that are going to sort everything out.
Appreciate that. I'm also kind of curious, like I heard you say, state control, and I really kind of I wrote down control. Do you think that we're still in this sort of era of like having to have really restrictive rules on the cannabis industry? Because I hear you say that public access is really important. I hear you say that we need to give consumers more options so that we can fight organized crime through that way. And it also helps consumers when you have more options because it's cheaper. But I'm curious, it seems like from industry's perspective that maybe we went too far in the control side of things on the state level for quite some time. And that has helped lead to sort of this emaciation of parts of the cannabis industry. So I'm kind of curious, what are your thoughts around that? Sort of how do we balance the public safety and public health aspects of what you're talking about and have a reasonably regulated industry, but then not overregulate and overtax to the point that we are legitimately choking off the industry?
Well, it's super interesting. I think a lot of that, well, first of all, we have to stop treating cannabis like plutonium, right? I mean, I think that the early states, especially, even in the initiatives written by the movement, essentially, that there was such a, it was so oh, please let us legalize, we will put in all of these protections to sort of, stave off the backlash. And that was understandable given the political reality at the time. But when we talk about public access, I think we're going to be talking a lot about reducing the burdens on the legal industry, right? Some of the tracking burdens and certainly, the taxation at the state and the federal level. The licensing, incredibly high licensing fees, making it difficult for small businesses to get involved. All of that goes to, safe consumer access and broad consumer access. And so yeah, I think a lot of what we want to see happen and we will fight for is an industry that is sustainable. And the only way that's going to happen is if we stop making it impossible to function and profit, in the regulated industry.
Cool. I appreciate that. One of the big headlines that just came out recently, a couple of weeks ago, is we saw the very first raid on a cannabis farm in quite some time. It wasn't necessarily for the cannabis thing. It was ICE going after immigration related cases at Glass House in Southern California. But, I think it definitely brought up a lot of feelings for folks who, had seen back in the day, Oaksterdam, rest in peace, Richard Lee, who just passed away this last week and did a lot for the medical cannabis industry and led us to this place, a rad Prop 19 in California. But, we sort of see this place now where I feel like because California's a great example where access is an issue, right? It's still banned in a lot of counties and a lot of localities in the state of California. And there was, there was a lawsuit quite some time ago about some of Glass House's product ending up in New York. I know New York, when they were opening their market, dealt with a lot of the proliferation of illicit products ending up on shelves before regulated products ended up on there. Can you also talk a little bit about sort of like that aspect, one of the three different markets you talked about, right? The sort of unregulated sort of like, illicit market. What are your thoughts around that? Whether it's like the size of some of these businesses that are growing in California and you're finding some of their products over state lines, like how are we going to fix that issue?
Well, first of all, to your original point, I got a text yesterday, and I haven't confirmed this. There was a snippet of video in it, and I haven't seen news, but I got a text yesterday that 14 legal farms were raided by ICE in and around Medford, Oregon yesterday. And I have been on calls all morning on other issues, and I have not gotten to look for that news, but it came from someone I trust. And like I said, there was a snippet of video. So I think, we may be talking more about ICE raids. And I think, I think from the perspective of ICE and that, section of law enforcement, they've gotten a lot of grief about going after agricultural workers because, you have farmers that supply food to the country that lost their minds and will lose their crops. And I think that cannabis farms may look like an easy and, low risk target for them. And so I assume we're going to see probably more of that. What I understand from friends in Southern Oregon and Northern California, which is where 90% of the domestically grown cannabis in this country has come from historically, and where we still grow the best outdoor cannabis in the world. I am not in Southern Oregon, but I am a big fan of the producers in that part of the world, and lots of friends. I have heard that it's that all of the laborers that are available to them come through work crews, and they have very limited abilities. They hire someone to bring in the work crew, and in the larger farms, and they have very limited ability to, or at least it's difficult for them to police that. Who's coming on their farm? They deal with the entity that brings the crew in, and so I think those are difficult problems. I think I'm assuming that it's similar in other agriculture. But I think, like in a lot of things, I think cannabis needs to be ready to be, the scapegoat, or at least the easy place to lash out at. And so we're likely to see a lot more of that. And that ties into the broader discussion of how we're treating folks who come here to work, who are, part of how we keep this country running, and people who are obviously working. I've seen agricultural workers work. It is neither unskilled labor nor easy. Those jobs are not going to be easy to fill, with college kids. And so, here again, cannabis intersects with the politics of the real world, and I think it's going to be a bit of a hard time for growers, especially outdoor growers in rural areas, and that's a total shame. Did I not answer your question, Kaliko? I sort of went.
No, that was excellent. I actually brought up another one for me. I was, as you were talking about that, I'm thinking about sort of the intersection. One of the things I always talked about when I was, pretty active in the cannabis industry was sort of like the need for cannabis policy folks, political folks, industry folks to not see themselves as a silo that operates outside of all of the other political issues, but just one part of the web. And so like, I'm kind of curious, you started to kind of hit on it a little bit, but like this intersection of like immigration, right? Like, but that also talks on sort of like, how do we treat workers and sort of our relation to labor, right? And that brings up a lot of issues for folks in the cannabis industry around like sort of, whether it's worker peace agreements and sort of things like that. But like, I'm just kind of curious, like, what are your thoughts about sort of that intersectionality of the cannabis industry, cannabis movement, and like, I think of it like more broadly as a political issue. And like, is that sort of the key to unlocking getting to the cannabis legalization when we are starting to walk hand in hand with immigrants' rights organization and labor, but that will necessitate the industry having a higher bar, right? And making sure that we are treating our workers right and creating companies that we can be proud of.
I think that cannabis companies are caught in a catch-22. In theory, and in the world we'd like to see, jobs in the cannabis industry pay a living wage, would be, able to be represented. But you're also looking at an industry that's paying tax rates beyond what any other legal business is paying, that can operate in ways that are circumscribed, unlike any other business, are stuck within their market, right? They can't bring product in or send product out of their state, and they're regulated, to within inches of their lives. And then, to point to them and say, right, you need to, why aren't you dealing with labor? Why don't you want a unionized workforce? Why aren't you doing this and that? But the problem is we've set up a system where they're not surviving. Right, they're barely surviving or not surviving, trying to keep their heads above water. I know, folks who own cannabis businesses that haven't taken money out of them in years, for themselves. And so it's just, you end up pitting labor, and the rights and the needs of workers, against, entrepreneurs and business owners who are barely surviving and don't know how they're going to make the payroll they have. And it's easy, like with immigration raids, it's easy to point to, those terrible industry cannabis people, and they're profiting off the plan and they're taking advantage of people. But I think for the most part, that's not the case. I mean, there are bad actors in cannabis like there are in a lot of industries. But I think they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And until we make it possible to actually function and profit as a cannabis company, we're not going to get to those issues. People are just not going to be able to pay the kind of wages that a lot of them would like to pay. And so I think, I think we're going to have to address some of those issues to get to a system that we'd like to see in the longer term. But I want to be careful about, trashing business owners in this space, who can't make it based on the rules for not being generous enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And for folks who, are new to the conversation around cannabis policy or, the industry and some of the nuances, for those who, don't know, retail operators, folks who are, the dispensaries that you go into to get your cannabis, they often operate at having a tax rate at the federal level over 70%, right? And so that's on gross receipts, that's on a net profit. So that means if you sell $1 million in cannabis, you owe 70% of that in federal taxes
before you do anything.
Not on, and that's including paying all your people and all of your expenses, right? Because essentially there's this part of the IRS tax code called 280E that says you can't write off the cost of doing business if you're doing business in a Schedule I drug like cannabis, right? And this was originally written in the 80s to keep a cocaine dealer from writing off his yacht on his taxes, right? But this is now being applied to every dispensary owner across the country. So, when Adam's talking about sort of how tough it is and the thin margins people are operating with, there is no margin. Like if you're doing things the right way, you are not making money in the cannabis industry. Is potentially able to pay yourself, but there's not actually any real money being made. So like, I could totally, sympathize and empathize with how tough it is for cannabis industry operators to do that. While at the same time, I do think that like, if folks are setting up business models where they're paying folks a living wage first, then if you can survive in these tough times, you can survive at any time, right? And so totally hear what you're saying. And for a lot of folks that got into this early on, I think the numbers just didn't add up the way they thought they were going to add up, right? And so like, this is me speaking with hindsight in 2025, that if you're still thinking about getting in the cannabis industry, you need to make sure that you're running numbers that are extremely conservative, right? Like, people have pie in the sky ideas of how easy it is going to be to make money and how easy it is going to get people to come in and buy your cannabis. That's just not the case. And so that actually brings up a point about some structural issues, right? You talked about the sort of taxation aspect of 280E. I know there's been some discussion since I had left the cannabis industry full time around rescheduling. This is a process that the Biden administration had kicked off and started with their HHS secretary sort of reviewing and trying to figure out, does cannabis belong in Schedule 1? Newsflash, it does not. But now we're in this process where it still hasn't happened. The Trump administration's taken over. We just got a new DEA administrator confirmed, I think, like last week or recently. So where do things stand with the rescheduling conversation, Adam? Where is MPP at on rescheduling? And then maybe we can kind of jump off from there.
I mean, I think MPP historically has been supportive of rescheduling for, under the idea that, take what progress you can get today and then ask for more tomorrow. And I think rescheduling is sort of a tough issue for everyone involved because it does a lot less than what people would like it to do. In fact, for the state industries, it probably does very little other than, hopefully potentially, ending the 280E problem. Right. I mean, there are people who look at that and say, oh, this is a pathway in for pharma to come in and, do XYZ and without arguing that one way or the other, cannabis doesn't belong in Schedule 3 either. Right. Cannabis doesn't belong. We don't schedule plants other than cannabis. No other plant is scheduled. That's sort of an insane designation. And it needs to be descheduled. I tend to believe, and predicting what the Trump administration or the people around them will do is probably a terrible way to try to make a living. But I tend to believe that because rescheduling was a Biden initiative, there's probably pushback within the administration not to finish up Biden's work, just because there's sort of a sense that they don't want to be associated with that at all. But they might do it. But I don't know if it happens, how much impact that it's actually going to have. It may, and hopefully, and it's not the only way that this could happen, but it may, open up research considerably, and that would be a giant step forward. Which is sort of a parallel issue to everything else, right? We're not allowing enough research. I just read that they're ending their contract with the Mississippi farm. They're not going to be getting all of their, they're not going to force all cannabis that's being tested medically to come from, one terrible farm that grows apparently crappy weed from everything I've heard. So we're sort of moving forward in that direction, but rescheduling is a little bit of to me, it's a little bit beside the point, right? It's a little bit of a distraction. It's not going to have a big change. It was a way for the Biden administration to say they did something and they reduced, controls, but it's like they found the sweet spot where they weren't really doing anything and could say they were doing something. And because, it hopefully would end 280E, there was enough people to say, okay, well, we'll take that. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on rescheduling at MPP.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective about it being a Biden era initiative and perhaps the Trump administration not wanting to follow up on it and having a little bit of pushback internally. I mean, I think it's also just one of these things where, despite a lot of the what I would call the MSO bro gangs on Twitter talking about how excited they were that Trump was going to come in and magically sort of reschedule things, he doesn't care about drugs. He's somebody who like doesn't drink. He's a teetotaler himself. He had a brother who died from addiction, and so like it feels like it's not ever been a priority for his administration. And he also, if personnel is policy, he continues to hire people who are not pro cannabis, right? And some people would point to like maybe RFK Jr. at HHS being pro cannabis, and maybe he's going to be able to kind of make this happen. But I think that's a really interesting perspective in terms of like them not pushing it forward.
I would warn people in the industry, because I've heard a lot of that. I heard a lot of that going into the election, right after the election, right? That Trump is going to, RFK talked a lot about psychedelics and he said nice things about cannabis at times. And, Trump was going to do this. And like I said, I think there's a universe in which he does, right? I mean, I had advised a lot of people in the industry going in that there's only one decision maker in this administration, and that the industry should come together and go directly to Trump and make that appeal. But I would warn folks in the industry that they likely have far fewer friends in the federal agencies than they think they do. And so hoping that the agencies are going to come in and do some great thing and save everyone may be misguided.
Coming up, because I think of it as a distraction, which I completely agree with. And I actually think that the industry spent a lot of dollars this distraction during the Biden administration, only to be left with sort of like having spent a lot of money and not have rescheduling yet. So I do agree that it is
think about banking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, banking spent 8 years that we've been working on safe banking.
I call banking the Federal Cannabis Lobbyist Full Employment Project.
Yes, dude. It's so much money being burnt on federal policy. And maybe in another episode we'll get into that part. But I know one of the things that has been a passion project for you as you've been working on legalization at the state level and advocating at the national level is stuff around homegrow. And I think as you were talking about sort of like public access, I'd imagine part of the sort of plan is making sure that not only do you have the ability to go buy from a dispensary, but that you have the legal right to grow a plant. Like I said, we don't schedule any other plant in existence, but for some reason we've decided that human grown-ass adults shouldn't be able to grow a plant in their yard. So any thoughts around sort of home grow?
Yeah, it's funny. It's been an issue that's been important to me for a long time, but I haven't, through my work, had an opportunity to really address it. And I'm excited to get to it with MPP. If you have legalized cannabis, but you have not legalized home grow, then you have not ended prohibition. You have only created a corporate exemption. If you strip away all of the licensing and the marketing and where you can have stores and all of that, the first principles comes back to the question, am I free to grow and use and enjoy this plant and to share it with my friends and to share it with patients in need? And that is the base question before anything else. You can end prohibition without creating a legal market, right? Without creating a private corporate market, right? I mean, it's not as effective, but you have not ended prohibition if people are still not allowed to grow the plant. It's real simple. And right now we have 4 legal states that do not allow home grow, where you can be arrested for growing this plant. We have at least 15 medical states, which is even less morally defensible, where you are not allowed to grow. Imagine telling a patient, yes, we understand you need this. Maybe, it helps your epilepsy. Maybe it's helping you get off opiates, right? But your insurance company will cover the opiates. But you have to go out and buy this plant that you could grow, but we'll arrest you if you grow it. But you can pay somebody who's got a license to grow it. And now I think that there's a legitimate government interest in making sure that you are not operating you are not running a commercial operation unlicensed. I think like in many businesses that's a legitimate government interest. But to tell me I can't grow at home for my own use, you haven't ended prohibition. And I think that part of being back in the movement is taking up those issues, whether it's home grow or the need to fix testing that industry is unlikely to spend time and resources on.
Yeah, well, I mean, like you said, someone's got to do that important work, and I've always sort of seen it as like it's the democratization of medicine, right? At a time
Mhm.
when it's so hard for people to get access to medicine, that this is something that like cannabis is like always fit in this really weird place where it both can be something that people use for enjoyment and for fun and for alleviating stress and all those sort of things, and there are therapeutic and medical benefits to it. And for quite some time, we've known this, but like there's been an entire prohibition apparatus at work, both in the federal government and in private entities like SAM, that are pushing sort of like these prohibitionist mindset sort of that era thinking, when we very much should be and could be alleviating a lot of people's pain and suffering through being able to grow their own plant. And I think about like my grandparents. I got into this industry because I saw them smoking weed together, watching TV at night, and it was alleviating their fibromyalgia and their sort of joint pain, and eventually became cannabis patients. And I was able to grow cannabis for my grandpa, and like that opened my eyes to this entire world of like, oh wow, this is about putting people's like not only like control of their body in their own hands, but in control of their own medicine. And we had this entire era of the Obama era where we talked about like getting in between a patient and their doctor, and that's all cannabis laws are, right? It's getting in between a patient and what they know is right for themselves. So I appreciate you guys working on that stuff. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and as bad as it is, it's interesting that this is really, even more of an issue in more rural states, right, where people do tend to have land, right? Like even if you legalize home grow, that's your problems with your HOA are going to be still your problems, right? That doesn't, your HOA isn't necessarily going to allow you to grow it in your front yard, right? You may live in an apartment where you don't have a place to grow, or, but. Uh, but a lot of the states that don't have home grow are states where people grow stuff, right? A lot of rural states where folks grow stuff on their property, and so I think that that's important, and I think it's a personal freedom issue, right? And I think that resonates in a lot of those states that might be more red states, right? The idea that the government has a right to come in and tell you you can't grow a plant on your own property is a gross violation of personal freedom, right? And I think also that as bad as it is that state governments are passing laws that allow cannabis use but don't allow cannabis growing, um, folks in the industry, folks who are making or attempting to make profit off of this plant, who are arguing against people's rights to grow this plant, there's a special place in hell for those people. That is there is no standing behind that. If you are looking to profit off this plant and fighting against people's right to grow it, then you are part of the problem.
From your lips to Jaw's ears on that one. I do want to point out one more one more group of folks that I think may be qualified for hell, which is folks who fight against social equity policy. And I'm curious, sort of in this backlash era against DEI, where the federal government is cracking down on all sorts of people who are trying to right the wrongs from decades and decades of oppression and systemic systemic racism. Like how are you thinking about social equity policy, especially at the state level right now, when it comes to the cannabis industry?
Yeah, I've had so many interesting conversations about this, with folks who are deeply committed to justice in the industry, and I am deeply committed to justice in the industry. And there's this dichotomy, right, where we understand the moral and ethical need to have a legal industry be supportive of justice and some level of community reparation for discriminatory enforcement and so forth. And I think that that's true among communities of color, mostly on the demand side of this. It's also true for small communities in the Pacific Northwest that lived under federal threat for decades, and people being forced to rat on each other, and people losing their farms. And so I think that's a vital component of a just system. The dichotomy comes where many of the social equity programs, as instituted, seem to have done little good or more harm than good in some places, tempting people to put up lots and lots of money into an industry and leaving them hanging, or an industry that that is itself failing, or it's set up under rules where they have to sell out their real interest in the license in order to be able to operate. And so I think that the baseline to allow equity and economic justice to happen in this industry is to make it easier and more to make it easier. Let me just say, to make it easier for small business to open and operate. Right? It has to be an industry that is welcoming to small business, that makes small business viable. Right? Is the word I was looking for. If entry into the industry is easier and less expensive and less onerous, and the industry itself is set up in a way that supports and encourages small business, then you have the basis for programs that can aim at specific, demographics to bring them into that industry. But right now, we're dragging people into an industry where in most states the industry is failing, right? And so, I think we have to, not get too caught up in the philosophical defense of programs that have not worked, right? And look deeper into what are the underlying variables that make it, that, other than poor design or poor execution, what has made it difficult to actually achieve the goal, which is some economic justice and opportunity for folks who've been impacted by the war on drugs.
For sure. I'm smiling because I have an answer for that. That's my personal answer, and I'm not going to put this on you. But I definitely think, like, when we're talking about sort of the way these things have been set up, and that, I really struggle when I hear people say programs that have failed, right? Because, like, programs have done what they can do with what they've been given, and too often we have very large, well-capitalized industry players who have fought against having equitable policies at the state level and have largely hamstrung them, right? I think there's some other systemic issues around, like, it's going to be a much more equitable market when we have a national marketplace and we don't have, siloed industries and that sort of thing. But I think it can't go without saying, especially in this time, like, we're 5 years post George Floyd. We're in this place where the industry seemingly plateaued for quite some time. It's having massive consolidation. You're having people drop out of the industry every day. A lot of those folks are people who got into the industry through social equity programs, who were sold on this idea of being able to have generational wealth. But I do think that, especially as, like, hear you talk about sort of the future really continuing to be at the state level, I think this is where we really got to, as an industry, come together to, I think you're right, to make sure that the playing field is as easy as possible for any small business to be viable. But I think what the struggle is going to be for the industry here is to push through this hard backlash moment where we're all kind of anti-equity, or at least not willing to say it out loud because Trump's doing what he did. We saw all the pushback in New York City, where New York did exactly, they put their money where their mouth was, right? For all of the people who complained about the rollout of the New York market said, we are going to make sure the people who disproportionately were impacted by prohibition are going to disproportionately benefit from prohibition. And that meant that they were going to get a set aside for a certain amount of licenses, that they were going to get the front seat in line, right? All of those sort of things. And so, I just think for industry folks who are listening, I want to make sure that people are not shying away from the principles that we laid out post George Floyd, because we managed to take that political moment and really shape what was happening in the industry. And that was happening before George Floyd. This is something that's been happening since, MCBA is in their 10th year now, founded in 2015. So this has been something that's been moving for quite some time. But I'm afraid, as I kind of watch from afar from the industry right now, I'm afraid that we are drifting away from being principled in the idea that prohibition specifically affected Black and brown men differently than it affected any other population. And the idea that we just want to make things easier for small businesses sounds good, but then it's also still not going to directly repair the harm. So I'm trying to figure out, how do we get creative in the Trump era? If we got to change our words, let's change our words. But how do we set up policies to still make sure we're not leaving that same group out to dry? Because I'm concerned that is what we are cementing in the industry right now, especially as more folks like myself drop out of the industry and go on to do other things. So, like, just any other thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's such a hard problem, right? You're fighting it on multiple levels. You're fighting it on the level of how do you set up how do you set up programs that will effectively give that opportunity, right? And how broadly can you offer that opportunity, right? And then the next level is, or the level under that is that even if you can get into the industry right now as a small business, your chances of success are very, very small because all the small businesses are failing, right? And then you have the political component on top of that, where, like you said, maybe the language has to change, right, in order for it to be more politically viable, right? It would all be great for us to be able to stand on principle in every state legislature and say this is what we want and we're right about it, and but that's not always how politics works, right? And I'm a big believer that you have to operate in the political reality that you find yourself in if you want to have impact. And so how do you re-explain or redefine what you're trying to do to get to the result that you're looking to get to, right, without hitting too many tripwires? And I'm not a big believer in toning down language to appease the king kind of thing, but I'm also a believer in that some things are going to get through state legislatures and some things are not going to get through state legislatures, right? And so I think we have a multi-level challenge. I think that we need to look at the design of the programs, right, and see what can work and what can't work. But if the industry continues to shrivel and die, right, then we're having a conversation about what do you teach in third grade after the communist revolution, right? Like we're so far out into something that doesn't exist at this point, that it becomes a dangerous conversation and can be a distraction. So like, how do we fight for justice in regulated markets as we're building or tweaking or changing regulated markets in a way that's going to be effective, but also, if, like I said, if all the small businesses in your state are failing, on the verge of failing, or look like they're going to fail in the next 2 years when they're up and running, then are we doing anybody any favors? And so let's figure out how to set up the industry and fight for an industry that's going to make it possible to build justice on top of it.
Well, I trust very few people other than you to be in the role that you're in right now, to take on and take the lead of such a important organization like the Marijuana Policy Project. And I very much am honored that you made this your very first open public interview since taking on the role at MPP. So I send you lots of good vibes as you take on this, and obviously continue to consider you a friend, and look forward to jamming with you as you kind of try to figure out what's coming.
Kaliko, I think you were 19 when we met. Maybe you were 20. A baby activist, and you have done so much. President of MCBA, you've run for office, you've done a ton of things. I'm so pleased that you've started the podcast again. I think your voice is vital and important. I think you're thoughtful, and you look at this from a lot of different angles, and that you are politically aware in ways that a lot of people that are in the industry are sort of issue siloed. And I think your voice is important, and your perspective. And so I'm thrilled to be on. I will come on anytime. And I'm excited to find ways to work together as I, set off into this new course running an actual organization.
Well, it's been a long time since I've been excited about what's to come in the cannabis movement, and I'm certainly excited with you at the helm. So thank you very much for being my guest and for being my good friend here, and sending lots of good vibes. Looking forward to having many more conversations. I know there will be many more for us to have. So appreciate you joining us, Adam. Thank you so much. And for everyone listening to this very first relaunch of the KalikoVision podcast, I appreciate you so much taking some time out, and look forward to doing many more great interviews with a lot more inspiring guests. So thank you so much for tuning in. Aloha.